Hello and welcome to lecture number 24. This is topic 2.13, Resistance and Revolt in the United States. The first learning objective is to describe the daily forms of resistance demonstrated by enslaved and free African Americans. For enslaved African Americans, there were several methods they could use on the plantation to resist their enslavement. Many of these were covert methods of resistance, which enslavers would not readily recognize as acts of resistance, while others were more overt. Covert methods included working slowly, breaking tools, and stealing food. Overt methods included running away. This was most likely done by enslaved people who were more assimilated and sometimes more often by enslaved males. This was because they could better blend into free communities in the North, and as males, they were less likely to have children they would need to leave behind when running away. Sometimes they escaped to maroon communities, but more often they sought safety with relatives who were free in the cities. We know a good amount about runaways because enslavers put out ads in local newspapers asking for help in returning runaways or by offering rewards. In these ads, we learn more about the characteristics and the types of people that were running away. There's many of these ads that were taken out by presidents of the US, like the one published by Thomas Jefferson seen on the screen. All of these actions carry the peril of physical retribution and violence from the enslaver. If the enslaver discovered that these acts, such as working slowly, breaking tools, or stealing food, were intentional, the enslaved people might be punished with whippings or other forms of physical violence. The same was true for running away. The lasting impact of these covert methods of resistance was the creation of a lasting negative stereotype about black people being lazy, slow working, or often sick and unable to do their work. We can see this in contemporary writings of enslavers like those of Benjamin Franklin. In his younger years, he enslaved people and complained about them in letters to his friends. He complained about their temperament, not being mild-mannered, or having a diabolical temperament. Benjamin Franklin's involvement in the debate over slavery was notable as he eventually became an abolitionist, and he reflected the complex attitudes of many prominent Americans of the time. The reasons these methods of resistance were employed by enslaved people was not necessarily to overthrow the system of slavery altogether, as that would be too hard to do by a few individuals on plantations that were located really far apart from each other. Instead, it was to gain greater concessions within the framework of slavery, whether that be more food rations, less work time, or less brutal treatment on the plantation. Sometimes the people who ran away would voluntarily return, hoping that the enslaver would treat them better upon their return. Just because the motive was not to overthrow the system of slavery altogether does not mean it did not help sustain the larger movements towards abolition. All these methods of resistance showed that there was humanity within the enslaved, that they were not okay or happy with their treatment. It was proof that slavery was not a beneficial institution to both the enslaved and the enslaver, as Southerners in the era sometimes tried to argue. Once people finally escaped slavery, this resistance became a point of pride for those who escaped. Whether they wrote slave narratives about their experience or became public speakers, people like Frederick Douglass often recounted the tales of when they stood up to their enslavers, either in covert or overt ways. Douglass's physical confrontation with the slave driver Edward Covey is famously recounted in his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845. He was sent to Covey to be made a more obedient slave or to be broken, as one would do with a horse. At the end of their physical altercation, Douglass was able to gain better treatment for the rest of his time on that plantation. Religious services and churches also played a significant role. By the end of the 18th century, black congregations within white churches started to branch out due to unequal treatment, such as segregated seating or praying areas. Black parishioners were unhappy with this treatment and even walked out in the middle of services to show their discontent. White congregationists wanted to keep black congregants for the financial benefits of their weekly contributions, but nevertheless, the first black independent congregations in the U.S. was Mother Bethel in Philadelphia in 1796. By 1816, it became the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which then had branches across the country through the early 1800s. Mother Bethel was founded by Richard Allen, a former enslaved person who purchased his freedom and became a leading figure in the early abolitionist movement. It later became the African Methodist Episcopal Church, led by Allen and Absalom Jones. The church became a powerful platform to the abolitionist movement and a critical center for black community life in the 19th century. Black churches and religious services continued to galvanize or strengthen daily forms of resistance. Black preachers frequently attacked the institution of slavery in their sermons, using religious justification to explain why it was wrong. The churches also served as multifunctional sites for community gathering, celebration, mourning, and sharing information to help people escape slavery. In the North, they became forums for abolitionist speakers and places where white anti-slavery organizations could meet, as they often couldn't find other venues due to the subject matter they were advocating for. The second learning objective is to describe the inspirations, goals, and struggles of different revolts and abolitionist organizing led by enslaved and free Afro-descendants throughout the Americas. One reason there were slave uprisings in what later became the United States is because of a large percentage of people brought through the transatlantic slave trade directly to the United States came from Central Africa. Many of these were enslaved people who were kidnapped or prisoners of war in the civil wars occurring there. This was also true for the Northwest African coast, where the other largest amount of enslaved people came from. This led to a concentration of former African soldiers in the American plantations, and areas with a higher rate of revolts often had a higher concentration of these former African soldiers. They provided a valuable military tactics and leadership as they did during the Haitian Revolution. The transatlantic slave trade, particularly during the peak years of the 18th century, forcibly brought millions of Africans to the Americas, creating a diverse population with various cultural and military backgrounds. The first revolt in what would later become the United States territory happened in 1526 when the Spanish, under the leadership of Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, started an expedition along the South Carolina and Georgia coasts. The map on the screen shows the area labeled as Tierra de Ayllon, or Land of Ayllon, named after the explorer. They brought Africans enslaved in Santo Domingo, which is modern-day Dominican Republic, to assist in building new settlements. The enslaved people revolted after being made to work under harsh conditions and brutal treatment. They overpowered some Spanish colonists, escaped into the Low Country, and integrated with the nearby indigenous communities, showing early alliances between African and indigenous people against European colonization. Moving from the first of the largest uprising on what is now the United States soil, the German Coast Uprising, or the Louisiana Revolt of 1811, was the largest slave revolt in the United States, partially inspired by the Haitian Revolution. It involved around 500 enslaved people and was brutally suppressed, but it highlighted the deep resistance to slavery in the American South. After the Haitian Revolution, some white planters and free blacks from Haiti resettled along the Louisiana coast to continue sugarcane plantation, the most lucrative crop in the Atlantic economy in the early 1800s. Enslaved people on these sugar plantations were familiar with the success of the Haitian Revolution. They heard about it through what historians call the common wind, or covert communication networks among enslaved people, originating in port cities like nearby New Orleans. The revolt was led by Charles DeLonde, a mulatto slave driver with certain privileges on his plantation. He organized support across local plantations and maroon communities, aiming to march on New Orleans to free themselves and possibly abolish slavery altogether. The revolt was violently suppressed by 2 regiments of local militia in the United States Armed Forces, making it the first time that American forces were called to suppress such revolts and increasing territories' incentives for statehood so that they could access the military's protection. So, from the biggest uprising to the most successful, the 1841 mutiny on the slave brig Creole. It was led by Madison Washington, an enslaved cook who had previously escaped to Canada. Washington was re-enslaved while trying to rescue his wife. Washington led a mutiny on the ship transporting enslaved people from Virginia to New Orleans, taking control and sailing to the Bahamas. It was controlled by the British Empire then, which had ended slavery in its West Indian colonies in the year 1833. After a short trial, Madison Washington and the other mutineers were freed, making this the most successful uprising in the United States. The Creole case of 1841 became an international incident, challenging the legality of slavery and the rights of enslaved people under international law. Later on, the enslavers and the shippers attempted to get compensation for their lost human property from insurance companies, as can be seen in the newspaper article on the screen. Religion also played a significant role in inspiring rebellions, providing moral and spiritual justification. Many enslaved people had been socialized through Christianity, and 2 major uprisings with religious inspiration were led by Nat Turner in 1831 and Denmark Vesey in 1822. Nat Turner, motivated by religious visions, led a rebellion in Virginia, resulting in his capture and confession. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion was one of the most significant and bloodiest slave revolts in American history, leading to widespread fear and repression in the South. Denmark Vesey, formerly enslaved, literate, and deeply religious, planned an insurrection in South Carolina to coincide with the French Revolution's anniversary. Vesey blended West African religious elements into his plan with the help of a local conjurer named Gullah Jack. The insurrection was uncovered and suppressed before it could be executed. Religion also inspired abolitionists and ministers like Maria Stewart and Henry Highland Garnett, but we're going to discuss them more prominently in topics 2.14 and 2.19 respectively. And finally, for the recap, the enslaved had various methods of resistance, like working slowly, breaking tools, and running away, aiming to gain concessions and fueling the abolitionist movement. Black churches added to the resistance against slavery. Revolts were facilitated by the presence of former African soldiers, with the earliest revolt in 1526, the largest revolt being the German Coast Uprising in 1811, and the most successful being the Mutiny on the Creole in 1841. Finally, religion-inspired uprisings like those of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.